podcast called The Battle for African Agriculture, the space where we challenge dominant narratives and imagine just sustainable futures, especially when it comes to food and farming in Africa. Today's conversation dives into one of the most urgent and overlooked issues shaping our food systems: the entanglement of trade policies, food imports, and the legacy of colonialism. Why do so many African nations import food they could grow locally? Who benefits from these arrangements and who loses? And how are modern trade regimes reproducing old patterns of dependency? To unpack this, I'm honored to be joined by Raj Patel, activist, economist, filmmaker, and author of the widely influential Stuffed and Starved in the Value of Nothing. Raj has spent decades analyzing how global systems shape our everyday lives, and his sharp critique of corporate food regimes continues to inspire movements across the global south. Welcome to the podcast, Raj.
Million, it's an honor to be here and an honor in some way to support the amazing work you're doing.
Thank you very much. Raj, before we dive into, the heart of the podcast, tell us a bit about your story. What sparked your passion for food, trade, and food justice?
Well, I honestly, I've been doing this since I was five. I mean, I grew up in England, but my ancestors, well, my mother was born in Kenya, but many generations ago, my family is from India. Some of my family's from India, and we were there, and it was one of my earliest memories is seeing extreme poverty in India, and I was so upset by it that the minute we got back home, I started renting out toys in kindergarten to raise money for for famine relief, and I've been doing hunger work since then.
Oh, that's fantastic. Let's start at the root, Raj.
Yeah.
How did the global food trade come to be so skewed in favor of the global north?
Million. I was looking at this question, and it's such a terrific question because it lets me answer that yes, food trade is skewed to the global north for now, but historically, the countries in the global south have been much more powerful and much more integrated in terms of trade, right? I mean, you've got the cross Indian Ocean trade, you've got amazing trade within Africa, within Asia, within Latin America. But the reason that over the past 500 years that the global north has come to dominate is because of colonialism and capitalism. And so, but I think it's worth just saying the global north is in charge for now, both because you can see at the moment this period of US and European decline and the rise of China and the rise of other forces in the global south. But also it reminds us that actually, the global sort of center of demography and demographic and economic growth this century is going to be Africa. So we should remember that actually, yes, historically the global north has been in charge because it has administered colonialism, but it doesn't always have to be that way, and it certainly won't be that way in the future.
But can you unpack that a little bit, especially for Africa?
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, with Europe's really with Britain taking the lead in colonialism, the European powers also felt like they needed to compete, and so you had various European powers, Italy in what was then called Abyssinia, and you had Germany in Namibia, you had Portugal all over the place. France, obviously, and then of course Britain as well, setting up things like the sort of settler colony and East Africa, and the Dutch, of course, in South Africa. So all of these colonists wanted to carve up Africa. And these were all sites either for really resource extraction or occasionally markets for some of their for their produce. But it was all part of an imperial vision, certainly for the United Kingdom, and then everyone else was catching up.
Hmm. Yeah, I sometimes get confused. Why did we sit on our hands and wait for them to really take the power from our hand? Why? That the why question is always always with me. At the end of the day, I think it will come back for in order to be balanced.
Well,
But
but I mean, to be fair, Million, I mean, people did fight back. I don't think there's a history of people sitting on their hands. I think that often these stories of colonialism erase the resistance from within Africa and the fight back.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Can you walk us through some of the ways food importers deepen dependency, particularly in African countries?
Well, I mean, this gets to the idea that I mean, we should be clear about what dependency is.
Yeah.
And it's both the idea that countries are not in control of their economies, that they are dependent on key imports for other countries. But it's not just that you're dependent on imports, like for example, America is dependent on the global south for bananas and coffee because we don't grow those things here. But that's not dependency in the way that you mean it. The dependency is also about an asymmetry of power, of who gets to set the terms of that dependency. And that history is a history of not just colonialism, where that in order to be able to have the goods from the global north and the technological development, countries had to abase themselves, and workers had to work to supply materials for the global north. But we now have this regime of debt. And I think this is the key mechanism that we need to understand, because once a country is in debt, then all of a sudden you have everything you need in place to turn that economy into one that concentrates on agricultural exports, that doesn't allow itself to develop industrial bases or technological bases, but instead becomes the site of tropical product export, so that the global north remains in charge.
Mm. I was also reading about, a situation like Haiti,
Mm.
and some African countries where organizations like USAID were flooding the markets of these countries with cheap foods. And the local community gets to used to, they get used to be to eat these foods. The oil markets in the country will be skewed to the global north. Some countries like Ethiopia, we never had rice is not in our diet when I was a child, but it came through aid. So dependency can come through aid too, no?
Well, I mean, and actually, Million, I was very curious about what you thought of the recent politics around USAID. I mean, we've, I
Yeah.
mean, I mean, here in the United States, there's uproar that USAID has been cut, and we know that there's it's certainly the case that there are going to be lives lost in Africa because of USAID, but you've had a longer experience of the problems with aid, and so I mean, what do you think of this cutting of USAID?
I've written an article about it, which I'm going to send it out. Some people say that there are so many people in pain now because of the cutting of this aid, and maybe releasing it's not the appropriate time. But in terms of the influence that USAID has had on our policies, especially biosafety policies in the country. I was in the room in meetings where um, people who've been supported by USAID kind of pushing for the change in watering down our biosafety laws and regulations. And I can give you a typical example of the Comprehensive African Agriculture Development Program, CADAP. And it was obvious that USAID was one of the forces who have influenced the outcome of that document. The Kampala Declaration was hugely influenced by USAID. So USAID was influencing our agricultural policies, our agricultural strategies, and city strategies, and opening the way for corporate control of our food systems. That's how I read it.
Me too. I mean, and I think it's really interesting to see the amnesia, right? To see people forget that. I mean, so for example, in South Africa, where I've spent a lot of time and do a lot of work still, there's definitely going to be lives lost because of PEPFAR being suspended. This is the AIDS, HIV/AIDS drugs
I know,
thing.
yeah.
It's ridiculous. But remember that the reason PEPFAR happened in the first place is because for 10 years before PEPFAR, we had antiretroviral drugs available in the global north, but it was thousands of dollars. and the countries in the global south were saying, all right, fine, we're going to just publish this. Let's make generic versions in the global south because obviously we can never afford what you pay in America, and let us make these drugs. And for 10 years, the US fought hard against any kind of relaxation, and millions of people died. And now USAID gives the money, and yes, it's important. People are alive because of this USAID money, but so many more people would have been alive if the US hadn't gotten involved in the first place. And I think this story of USAID makes us hostage to the idea that to a certain forgetting of history, where USAID has always been the sort of gentle arm of violent US policy. I mean, in Zimbabwe, USAID and the CIA share the same office. I mean, it's not very well hidden. We know that these people are often the same people. So it's not we shouldn't be surprised that these aid complexes are part of an aggressive policy that comes from the donor countries.
Neocolonialism, we have a name for it.
Mm.
So, what role do institutions like the IMF, World Bank, WTO play in shaping trade rules that affect food systems in general and in Africa in particular?
Well, to understand this, we really have to look to the crisis of the 1970s, when a number of countries, particularly African countries, were leading a vision for the world that was called the New International Economic Order. It was going to be a way in which countries in the global south could have some sovereignty over their food systems and over their supply chains. But the New International Economic Order happened at the same time as there was an oil crisis, and then a food price crisis, then inflation and stagflation. But all of a sudden, the oil producing countries had a lot of money because they had raised the price, and no one else had a choice but to pay them. So they had a lot of dollars, and these dollars were circulating in the international economy, and it meant that borrowing rates through the 1970s were very low. And so a lot of countries in Africa borrowed money at low interest rates. And then the neoliberal turn in America started under Jimmy Carter and then was continued under Ronald Reagan, of what was called the Volcker shock, which was a very high rise in the rate of interest. And all of a sudden, you have countries in the global south being unable to pay their loans, and they needed new loans to repay just the interest on the old ones. And at this moment, the IMF and the World Bank become much more important players. Before that, actually, they were not significant players in terms of the governance of countries in the global south. But once they become the gatekeepers to your country's solvency, then what they started doing was structural adjustment plans. And this is a way, like, imagine if you go to the bank and ask for a loan, and the banker will say, yes, but only if I can come in your house, rearrange your furniture, tell you what you're doing, what your wife's doing, and what your children are doing. And this is exactly what the World Bank, IMF did. And so they set the rules for trade. They said, well, you don't need a big government. You need to shrink your government. You need to devalue your currency. You need to have more export orientation. You need fewer controls on companies, less protection for labor and the environment. All of this so that companies can come in, get dollars, and then you will be able to repay your loans.
Exactly. Thank you very much. I think you already responded to my following question. Are there historical moments like the structural adjustment programs that laid ground for today's dependence?
Well, yeah, that's it. I mean, it is from the 1970s, but then through the 80s you have these structural adjustment loans, and I do want to make clear though that sometimes, I mean, even here now, people misremember that period, because sometimes you can say, well, the bank didn't get it right, and then they had to readjust. And now, if you look at the growth curves, you can see that actually, ultimately, there was trickle down, and somehow, people got better off. But that's not what happened. In the 1980s, there were protests, and people demanded that, and it was people on the streets in major cities in Africa rioting against the IMF and the World Bank, and that caused the change, and that caused a more redistributive politics. It wasn't natural; it didn't come out of the air. It wasn't just trickle down. This trickle down's a useless idea, because it then deprives us of agency, of being able to pull down some of this wealth, and that's what happened.
Now they were called out,
Mm.
Yeah.
And you were involved in that, Million, right? Tell me about that, though.
We try to do that, in so many ways. From with the African Biodiversity Network, we're working on protecting African states.
Mm,
Um, I think we were part of, we lucky to be part of a grouping where we had African giants like the Ethiopian Hildebrand of Xavier, Melako Rede, and there was this Nigerian also, I forgot his name, and somebody from Zambia. They were leaders, a global
mm,
leader on the seed and biodiversity movement when all those negotiations on CBD and the biosafety protocols did happen. So they were from the government side, but we meet quite regularly.
yeah.
And as part of the African Biodiversity Network, we were pushing for the rights of farmers, for no patent laws. We're against patent laws.
But
Yeah,
but but then million. I mean, people will hear the convention on biodiversity, and that doesn't sound like it's the World Bank. So how did the World Bank make itself manifest in that problem?
more and more these days. The World Bank is basically the bank of the powerful, as you know. So they want to stretch their hands, wherever there is money.
Yeah,
They want to shape policies.
that's right.
The biodiversity law, the biodiversity regulations are very much tied with biosafety laws and biosafety regulations. And GMOs, the companies want to push genetically modified organisms into the African market. And the World Bank and IMF were their arm in doing that. They were arm twisting in so many national governments. So they very much, interwoven and they work together, as you know.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, and I mean, for me, it was also very interesting to see that the World Bank would turn up in all kinds of places because these were moments where governments were saying, well, we don't want your products, particularly genetically modified crops, and you would find the strangest kinds of regulation. The U.S. Trade Representative even now is fighting against monitoring baby milk powder for contaminants, for example. They say this is a non-tariff barrier because you don't want your babies to be poisoned by things. You must just trust us, and you must trust your domestic producers. And I find it quite ridiculous to see how many places the trade representative and the bank end up.
Yeah. Let's explore issues related to neocolonialism in a policy disguise. You've
Mm.
written about the colonial roots of hunger. How do today's trade policies continue that colonial project?
Well, I mean, I think when we remember colonialism, we shouldn't just remember that it was like, the bad guys were over there and the good guys were all in our country, because we had our own bad guys, right? In the history of India, for example, if you look at the situation in contemporary India with Narendra Modi, look at who the oligarchs are in India. These are mainly, they're not all, some of the richest families are the ones who are also the ones who were ready to work with the British and be the bankers for the British in their opium wars, for example. The Tata family, you may have heard of. They're the people who own Jaguar Land Rover and a bunch of other companies. But they were opium bankers for the British, and they made their money not by fighting British colonialism because they were Indian, but by making money from British colonialism because they were Indian. So let us remember that, because that helps us understand that when we have our own national bourgeoisie, as Frantz Fanon talked about, they're the people who are betraying working farmers and working people and working families. And that's the way that neocolonialism works, is you will have some of the largest landowners and the largest sort of chiefs who have control over vast areas. And then they will license the companies to come in and produce their primary commodity crops, and there will be a buddy-buddy partnership between the bourgeoisie and these foreign capitalists. And that neo-colonialism is very much what it looked like under old colonialism. That there would be, local rajas or princes or whoever it was who was given some, little slice from the pie, so that they would make sure that working people were kept quiet and indigenous people were exterminated, and all of this would happen under old colonialism and neocolonialism. But the difference now is the weapons that are being used.
Yeah.
So, in general, in old colonialism, and again, this gets to your question of how was Africa overrun so quickly by Europeans? I mean, Europeans had guns, and that kind of weaponry is really quite overwhelmingly powerful. And the weaponry that they have now is financial. Because if a country wants to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, it needs to be able to invest. I mean, what country can build hospitals without a bank lending it money? The hospital isn't going to come out of nowhere. So, in this moment of borrowing, you have to borrow in something. What are you going to borrow in? No country is going to trust your own currency if you just print it out. So you have to, like Zimbabwe, so you have to index it to something. What do you index to? Either gold or dollars. And these days, dollars are much cheaper than gold. So then, you're figuring out that this neocolonialism is really about whose currency are you going to be strapped to. And this means that in some ways, China is, sure, the terms of Chinese lending are a little better than European, but it's still hostage to debt repayment. And I think this is quite important. And I'm actually curious about how you're feeling about Chinese investments in Africa right now, because what I'm hearing is the terms are much less draconian than the World Bank. I mean, China isn't coming in and saying you should do this with your economy, but because at some level they don't have to. The infrastructure for colonial investment is already there, and China's just stepping into it. But what do you think about the Chinese investment, Million?
In the countries that they were managed very well,
Mm.
followed, I don't know the details to be honest with you, but from the little information that they have in Ethiopia, for example, they really changed the infrastructure in Ethiopia. They upgraded a lot of infrastructures. They opened a lot of factories in whatever. So, yeah, I mean, there is always some things here and there, but then grossly, it's good. But there are some countries who didn't manage it very well, where they came entered into the local trade and local market. It can easily corrupt you, It's very easy for them to do that. In back home, there is no government who say that, oh, you are doing this, you're bad. There is not that. It's not like that. So there's no accountability to some extent. So in some countries, it didn't work out very well. In some countries, it really work out very well.
Mm.
So it all depends on whether the country that they operate in has a good governance structure, at least semblance
Yeah.
of good. You go to DRC, for example, they own this big extractive unit there. Even the minister of the country sometimes cannot go there even. So
Mm.
these are scenarios. So it's different. Lots of shades of gray.
Yeah, it is complicated. I mean, you're right.
No. Yeah. So, well, okay. How do you respond to the arguments
Mm.
that importance simply fill gap or boost consumer choices?
Explain this argument a little bit to me, because I'm always confused when I hear it.
Imports create a dependency. There are some countries like in Africa, in Central Africa, there are some countries, Gabon, for example, 70 to 80% of Gabon's food is imported from outside. And the figure is different in different countries, but it's still high in so many African countries. So when you criticize this now, because this food is coming because there's gap in the production of that food in that particular country, so it's filling this gap. What do you say that about? What do you say about this kind of argument?
I mean, why is there a gap in the first place? And secondly, what kind of a gap is it? I mean, do you want the food that we have here in the United States, for example? I would submit that you don't, because there was a recent study funded by the Rockefeller Foundation about the American diet. And it turns out that for every dollar we spend on food in the United States, we spend an additional dollar on healthcare just for diet-related disease. And then
Really?
of that, yeah, and then on top of that, there's additional like environmental, ecological, and
Yeah.
worker externalities. So essentially, for every dollar we spend on the food system, we spend $2 extra on other costs. One of which is healthcare. So
Yeah.
are we saying, well, what's really missing in Africa is food that makes you sick? Because then I think we could probably do without that.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously. Yeah. No.
But I hear this argument in a different way as well, which is here in the global north, people will say, well, look, if we don't buy their bananas and chocolate, what are they going to do? The workers there are asking for money, and I mean, at some level, there's an interesting question here, which is. Um, if you have small scale agroecological coffee or chocolate production, and these things are possible, um,
Mm.
then by not buying those things, you're removing the main cash crop for this market, and isn't that a bad thing? And my response is, well, look, you're saying that your demand has created this huge infrastructure of cocoa and banana production, and now you're saying, well, and all you owe people is not to consume that. No, that's
Yeah.
bad mathematics. What you owe is the history of colonialism. That's what you owe. You don't really owe that you stop
Yeah.
eating bananas and it feels like a
Yeah.
privation for you in the global north. You
Yeah.
owe reparations. And I think
Yeah.
that question of reparations is one that hasn't really been spoken about. Obviously, not under the Trump administration. They'll never talk
Yeah.
about that. But I mean, the fact is, the global north owes the global south. And it's only through a recognition that the global north owes the global south that we will ever have this kind of flip of an understanding of it's not just that people should grow bananas for us in the global north, but it's also we need to have a conversation about land reform and the way that land is structured under neocolonialism is large amounts of land or small farmers growing a monoculture because they have no choice. Now,
Yeah.
under a different kind of administration with
Mm.
funding to transition from monoculture into something else, we could imagine lots of different things. We could imagine a food system where you didn't have to import 80% of your food because you weren't exporting, you weren't using the land for growing bullshit crops, and instead you were growing things that actually mattered for your local economy.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, export is a very very interesting thing, and it's a very complex thing, as you know.
Mm.
Why do we focus on export crops? And what's the impact of that? It's market-led agriculture is one of the push by the green revolution of the green revolution agenda, as you know.
Mm.
So I mean, it destroys biodiversity because the focus is on a few crops. And to grow those crops, what methodology do you use? Do you use your own agroecological method, or do you inherit other methods of production? When you
Mm.
inherit, it means the usage of a lot of agrochemicals. And what we were talking about is hidden costs would come there.
Yeah.
Health costs, environmental costs, a lot of things would come. I think the focus, I mean, that's my next question is related to food sovereignty. When food
Mm.
becomes a commodity, then the problem starts from there. Are you feeding your own people with the land that you have, or are you feeding people outside of your country?
Mm.
That's what exports. So food sovereignty. What does real food sovereignty look like for you? I know that you have written quite a lot about food sovereignty. I think one time I read something that you said um, that I usually use, like a phrase, even a prisoner is food secure. So
Right.
that's what you say. I use that yeah, I use that phrase quite a lot of times. So what's food sovereignty for you, and how do you relate food sovereignty to the fight uh, against neocolonialism?
So let's start with food security. So you mentioned this term, and food security is that you've got access to sufficient and nutritious food to lead a healthy and active life. But as long as you have access to it, that's all that is demanded for the condition of food security. So that's why, I say, well, you can be food secure in prison. If you're getting 3 meals a day, you have access to enough food to live a healthy and a healthy life. Your conditions may suck, but you're food secure. So to be food sovereign is to be able to have power to decide how your food system looks.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so the way that food sovereignty looks to me, to answer your question, is lots of democratic conflict. Because, in the food system itself, we have systems that are very, power, that have very unequal power relations. You have people in the city buying from people in the country. So who gets to decide? Is it the people in the city who decide what happens to me, or the people in the country who decide what happens to the people in the city? We need to be able to figure that out. And the way to do that is through democratic conflict. But also, we talk a lot about celebrating family farms, but we also know that families are a zone of extreme patriarchy. Must we also celebrate women's oppression in order to have a family farm? Well, no. So we must have an idea of conflict, even within the home, that is healthy and that leads towards equality. Because otherwise, we're not really talking about food sovereignty. We're talking about, we'll have some food sovereignty here, but we'll have domination over here, and that's fine. So, and this is what I love about La Via Campesina's invention of the idea of food sovereignty. Initially they invented it in 1995. Well, a little bit before that, but it announced it in 95 at the World Food Summit in Rome. And they said, look, we don't want food security. Food security is what your neoliberal people are saying. Don't worry your little head about how all this happens. As long as there is food, if it comes off the ship from America, wherever it is, don't worry. As long as you have access, everything's fine. And La Via Campesina said, no, what we want is power. And we want power over the food system to stop you guys dumping your goods below the cost of production and wiping out our farmers. But one of the things about La Via Campesina is that it is a permanent and very painstaking democratic process. So in 95, what they were saying is, well, the food sovereignty really means that you don't dump your agricultural products on us. And they were thinking from Mexico about US dumping corn at below the cost of production in the Mexican market and destroying the livelihoods of Mexican farmers. But after 5-10 years, what La Via Campesina said was actually, no, food sovereignty is also about an end to violence against women. And they say that because food sovereignty means equality, not just in terms of democratic decision making at the national level, but also in the home. And again, this shows what food sovereignty is about. It's not just about are you eating? It's about how we distribute power in a way that is equitable. So that's what food sovereignty looks like to me.
Now, in most African countries, you hear governments talk about food sovereignty. Even the African Development Bank talks about food sovereignty, and that means producing your own agrochemicals, basically.
No, but what words do we have that they haven't tried to steal? I mean, when we were talking about organic agriculture, then they're like, fine, we'll do monocultures of organic agriculture. And agroecology, well, they've tried to subvert that by using things like regenerative agriculture. And they're not talking about labor, really. They're just talking about, just making extraction a little less extractive. I think this is a sign that we're doing well, that our language of sovereignty is making it into places. But what we have to do now is defend it and move away from, as you say, this ridiculous position that food sovereignty is about being able to make your agrichemical. Or, in Europe, the French are saying food sovereignty is so we can use the French military to protect our supply chains. In Italy, they're saying food sovereignty is we can kick out brown people and their because we must have pure Italian food, whatever that means. This language can be very dangerous. But it's also, when you're seeing food sovereignty and African, the development banks and the agencies using food sovereignty, how do you think about pushing back? How do we reclaim this idea?
We have actually analyzed the document that they produced. Really analyzed it. They produced compacts. These compacts are agreements with 40 African countries. And they have said that they've raised more than $60 billion to support this
Mhm.
compact. Now they are talking about merging these compacts with the CADAP plan of action, the
Mhm.
Kampala plan of action, as they call it. So we analyzed it and we found out that actually it erodes our seed sovereignty. Because they are talking about, improving your seeds and these patents and whatever. And it actually exacerbates the land situation for our farmers because inviting there's so many businesses from outside to farm in Africa. It means producing a high number of agrochemicals and artificial fertilizers and pesticides, and that would mean that what that would mean they just
Mm.
pushing the farmers into a path which is difficult to excrete themselves out of it. So yeah, so the gender, when they talk about gender, if women could get access to credit, it should be fine. It's money. Africa exporting is no good to outside. That is export oriented. So it's a green revolution agenda called food sovereignty, basically.
But we should talk about this green revolution. I mean, I think people forget that the green revolution is was always a political intervention to keep things the same in rural areas, or rather to
Yeah.
favor large-scale farmers in rural areas so that people in the cities wouldn't rise up. If you look at the origins of the phrase "the Green Revolution," it comes from the head of USAID in 1968, a man called William Goud, and he said, he was talking about the Green Revolution. He was in a Senate hearing where the senators were saying, well, we understand what the Green Revolution is. It's sort of a package of technology plus, the subsidies that you need to pay farmers in order to be able to adopt these things. Again, the Green Revolution wasn't just about seeds. It was about a whole structure of economic policy. And he said, yeah, that's right. But the reason we're doing this is because it's not a red revolution like that of the Soviets, and it's not a white revolution like that of the Shah of Iran. It's the Green Revolution. And the idea of the Green Revolution was to make sure that people didn't go communist, that people in cities were not going to rise up and demand radical change. And so if you make cheap food available to the people in the cities, they won't worry too much about the fact that life's pretty shitty as long as they can eat. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to sort of fill that part into our discussion because
Yeah,
you're saying the Green Revolution, and I think people sometimes think the Green Revolution is just about seeds and about some corporations making money from the seeds. But in fact, it's much bigger than that. It's certainly about companies making money from seeds, but it's also about stabilizing relations of power in a way that's very unequal, but allowing enough cheap food to be available so that those relationships are not questioned.
yeah. Raj, from your experience, what are the most effective ways of pushing against these trade regiments? And how can movements of movements like AFSA can push back against these draconian trade regimes?
Well, I mean, I think you need a sort of twin approach. One is to develop the alternatives that you want to see, right? I mean, there's no point, if tomorrow the draconian trade regime ends and we have no practice at being able to do the alternative, then we're in trouble. So I definitely think that half of the problem is, and again, AFSA is already doing this through in many different places, figuring out what an agroecological future would look like, having practicing some of the policies of public supply chains, making sure that we have the expertise and the knowledge to be able to enter government. But the other side is absolutely a more aggressive and resistive stance against these policies. And you're seeing some signs of that. In India, for example, at the World Trade Organization, is increasingly aggressive and at saying, well, no, actually, we need domestic supplies in case there's a climate emergency, in case there's another food price spike. And so we're developing our own domestic policy, and we don't care what the WTO does. Go screw yourself. And I think that's quite important, right? That you have a government intervention that is
Yeah.
strong, that is powerful, that is also resisting. And to make the government to do that is difficult. But this is work that you and I have been involved in for some time. I was a part of a group called Seatini under the under the great Yash Tandon in Harare, where we were working.
Now,
Yeah,
what's happening in Uganda? Yeah.
yeah, and it was a fantastic. I mean, it is a fantastic organization, right? The Southern East African Trade Information Negotiations Initiative. We were training civil servants to fight back against, European and U.S. trade law, and it's important to be able to do that, to have governments stand up for the rights of Africans. So. I think you need both of these things. We definitely need the alternatives, and we need the government to pay for them. But we also need the government to stand up against this crap, because otherwise we have no choice. So I think it's a dual sort of approach of entering government, being powerful within government, making government do what we want, but also developing these alternatives ourselves.
Yeah. Would that be a response also? What role does agroecology play in challenging trade-driven food dependence?
Um, well, again, it depends what you mean by agroecology, and sometimes we have to fight to remember that agroecology is not just a technique of growing food, right? I mean, often the shorthand that people think about when they think about agroecology is that it's polyculture as opposed to monoculture, and that you're just producing inputs and using maybe local seed, maybe not, doesn't matter. But it's that you're more dependent, you're less dependent on other people on farm. Um, but I don't like that. And it's not actually part of even the loosest definition the FAO has involves a circular and solidarity economy as part of agroecology. And people often forget that actually, people don't eat everything that's grown on farm. You need a market to sell your product to. Um, and the journey that the food takes from the market and the journey the money takes back is actually part of the story of agroecology, and it's often forgotten. And I mean, actually, again, I'm really curious about this in the context where you've been really involved in agroecological research. How much, engagement with the sort of broader uh, ideas of territorial markets do you hear from people who are involved in the agroecological side of things?
Not that much, this supermarketization of our trade system is very much powerful. People see supermarkets as a sign of growth,
Mm.
sign of development. But interestingly, I had a very interesting discussion with the East African community parliamentarians. So we're talking about territorial markets, and a Kenyan a Kenyan lawmaker said that the Kenyan government has actually started to upgrade these small territorial markets all over Kenya. And they are facing some challenge, when they do that. In some of these markets, people don't use them. They build them, they upgrade them, people build them. But that's another kind of problem. But there is a focus now, increasingly, on these small territorial markets, and we are pushing for a particular kind of law to support these small markets in Africa. And we are trying to tie it up with this African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement.
Mm.
So we are trying to do that, but the level of understanding needs a lot of improvement. But people know the value of this market. There are cultural places, social places, economic spaces also. So yeah, they do.
But I mean, I take your point though, Milian, that supermarkets do feel like progress compared to an open air market. I mean, they've got air conditioning, they've got machines, they've got electricity. Um, but I think it's interesting that part of for me part of this circular economy story has also to involve public purchasing and public supply chains.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah.
Because I mean, like, part of the supermarketization uh, process is about owning what used to be public infrastructure, right? To be able to take a public port and make it private, or
Yeah.
to use shipping facilities, or just to steal the rights to the road to be able to then do whatever it is you want to do. This is a privatization of public infrastructure, and one of the examples I'm very excited about that we're following, you and I, in IPES, is in the Indian state of Andhra Pradesh, where it's 40 million people, about 4 or 5 million, no, 6 million farmers, 1 million of whom are already doing agroecology. Um, and in this area, they're not just interested in teaching farmers how to grow polycultures, although that's
Yeah.
definitely part of the story. But they're interested in figuring out, well, look, can we get the government to buy agroecological food for school meals, for example, or for hospitals, for the local clinic.
Oh, definitely.
Um, so this public, the idea that,
Procurement, there's a public procurement term.
and then the public owns the supply chain between the farm. I think that's quite important. So it's not just agroecology on the farm. You have to have agroecology off farm as well.
Yeah, actually, we are starting research on participatory actually research on for public procurement of agroecological products. Are they doing it? If they are not doing it, why are they not doing it? What will be the impact of procuring agroecological products on the farmers also?
Yeah.
Because basically they give the market, they would produce it, you see?
Mm.
So they may have so many elements, environmental, health benefits. So this is one of the areas that we're exploring as AFSA.
Fantastic. And if people want to find out more about, I mean, we should say that a territorial market is just a market where that it's sort of not a globalized market, but in fact can range from the local village to a region. But
Yeah, big, yeah.
but these ideas are really taking off around the world. We've just finished some research uh, looking at school lunches in particular for the upcoming IPES report on labor. But there are really interesting supply chain laws, like in Brazil, that require 30% of food served in schools to be agroecological
Yeah.
or local rather, and then there's an agroecological bonus of 30%.
Yeah, no.
So these laws can make a real difference.
Yeah, I agree with you. The Brazilian example is very much excellent.
So,
We're finalizing Rise in this fantastic discussion. If you could reimagine global trade routes from the ground up, where would you begin?
well, the great joy of my reimagining all of that is that I wouldn't be in charge. I think, I mean, in part, right? First, I would begin with reparations. I think that um, we're in the era of catastrophic climate change. We're in an era where the majority of Pakistan was flooded, a few years back, and it's just ridiculous that we can pretend that we're still living in the 20th century with our trade arrangements. So we need to rethink and repay from the global north to the global south. But that injection of money offers a way of engaging in farming that is much more sequestering of carbon, that is more sort of local centric, but is also capable of exchange, but of an exchange that is non-exploitative. And that does mean, I mean, America will never grow coffee or bananas or cocoa. We just, we don't have the climate for it. But if countries in the global south choose that they would, like to set aside this amount of their land, but no more for coffee, and then reap extreme rewards because we have a very inelastic demand here, that would be terrific. But that's what a sort of food sovereign approach would look like. It would be in the framework of a new international economic order that doesn't look like a predatory one, and the one that the past 500 years have been characterized by.
Do you think the disruption that this president is causing would lead into that somehow?
Well, I certainly think that we're at the end of American hegemony, and I think that this is good and bad, right? I mean, it's because we had a previous period like this where, at the end of the First World War, Britain had come to the end of its colonial era of hegemony. And there was a big pandemic, and then there was a huge period of debt, and it all looks very familiar, right? That we had the Spanish flu, millions of people died, and then Britain couldn't repay its war debts. Britain and its greatest rival, America, were in very tense relationships. America had plans to invade Britain and Canada. This is called War Plan Red, right? And this feels very much like the time we're in at the moment. And it was conceivable, even as late as 1928, that the US and the UK would have gone to war. In the end, the war was with the fascists in Germany, and that was still catastrophic, right? It ended with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was horrible. And so, yes, the end of American hegemony is a good idea, but what comes next may not be great. And this is what history teaches us, that what we could be entering an era of fascism. We could be entering an era of Chinese quasi-socialism. And maybe we want that more than we want American hegemony, but maybe there's something still better that we could fight for. But I do think we're coming to the end of this period of US dominance. And this is what the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci called the interregnum, this period where the old institutions have died, but the working class has not yet mastered the tools of government. And so until we do that, until we have that mastery, I think we're in very dangerous times.
We'll have a separate discussion about the artificial intelligence role into all this chaos. That will be another discussion, yeah.
It will. But yeah, I mean, but I do think, yeah, for now, I mean, if we're just looking for moments of hope, then I think, no matter what comes next, agroecology is going to be quite important in the story, because it is either, a sort of survival strategy, or it's a pattern for imagining how the world could be substantially better.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Thanks so much, Raj. But final message for youngsters, African young thinkers, farmers, navigating this complex system that you're ably describing. Any advice? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the advice, of course, is to support you, Million, and to join in the movement to make agroecology ascendant. But this means sometimes, I mean, this does mean not just planting things in a different way or shopping differently. I mean, this is about activism. This is about organizing and militancy. And it's going to feel uncomfortable, and particularly if you've not done it before, and particularly for young people, there's always going to be a first time where you go on your first protest. So go with people who have done it before. Go with a movement. Go with an organization. Don't just do it by yourself. Turn up, but turn up strong and militant and unafraid. Well, I mean, we're all afraid on the when the police are shooting at you, you're always afraid, and it's wise to be afraid. But be bold and brave in knowing that you are fighting for something that matters, and fight together, not apart.
Thank you so much. This was excellent. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Million, for all the work that you do. It's such an inspiration.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Million, thank you.